All right, so this is graphic design essentials for FRC teams. So if that's an unpleasant surprise to you, you can go find a place to be if you're in the wrong place, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I kind of already surveyed the room. It sounds like we've got a lot of photographers, videographers, designers, web designers, and so we're going to kind of touch on all of those things just a little bit, kind of get our feet wet, talk about some best practices, and I'm going to frame most things in a design space because that's what I do, but it's all going to apply to your photography, your videography, everything across the board, okay? So just a little bit about myself. I am a professional graphic designer. I work in a freelance capacity, so that means I work with a bunch of different clients, basically running my own business, and so that's really cool because I get to work with a lot of different companies and manage a lot of different brands and work on a lot of different styles of projects. So that's just kind of what I bring to the table as far as this. And then just kind of a housekeeping note, we'll mostly save questions, I think, and then I'm going to try to carve out a few minutes at the end and we can do some questions at that time. So just know that if something's super, super confusing, let me know, though. I'd love to kind of hit that in the moment if everyone's super thrown off. So, sound good? All right, cool. So let's get started with kind of establishing a working definition, because if we don't know what graphic design is and we don't know how to discuss it or define it, that we can't really get anywhere. So does anyone have kind of a working definition? How would you define graphic design when I say that?
Pictures or images or videos that attract attention.
That attract attention. Okay, I like that. Any other thoughts? What is graphic design? Yeah.
Digital art.
Digital art. Okay, nice.
I was just going to say taking like real life things and just converting it electrically.
Okay, nice. I like it. So digital seems to be a piece of it. Having kind of some kind of purpose seems to be a piece of it. So let's take that and let's flesh it out a little bit. Let's take a look at this image. Design or not design? What do you think? Give me a thumb. What do you think? Yay or nay? Okay, we got a mixed crowd, but we seem to be mostly I would agree with the no's. This is probably not design, okay? What about this? Yeah, we feel pretty confident. Maybe this is design. I would say this is definitely graphic design. This is an example of graphic design. Okay, so we kind of have this intuitive idea. Okay, so maybe this oil painting isn't. Okay, but maybe this magazine cover is. So I'm just going to throw out there a working definition for us, and we'll kind of go with this as our definition. So fine art versus design, because those are going to be different things. So the first image I showed you, I would call that fine art. So it's purely for aesthetic purposes. It's just because it's pretty or interesting, just for the sake of itself. And it's totally subjective. There's no right answer, right? You could be like, hey, I'm the artist, whatever. That's what I wanted to make. Deal with it, right? That's what you can do in art. It's awesome. Design actually serves a specific purpose, and it is objective. And we don't have right answers or wrong answers, really. This isn't math, okay, where it's that level. But it's kind of like maybe your English essay, right? There's maybe better answers and worse answers, right? Like your English essay isn't like wrong, like you just get checked off as wrong, but maybe you didn't handle things as well, you didn't present your argument as well as you could have. That's kind of what graphic design is like. Does that make sense, that distinction? So it's going to be a visual that's for a specific purpose, and it's going to be a little bit objective. There's going to be better ways to handle it and worse ways to handle it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about a couple different types of design. We've got logo design. Okay, so that's developing a brand mark for a company or for any of your teams. We've got print design, so that would be brochures and posters and flyers and things like that. Package design, so anything that you purchase that was designed by someone, whatever packaging is on there. Web design, obviously super, super important. And then UI, which is user interface, or UX, which is user experience. And so that's like people who are designing how you navigate through an app, right? And how to get you to see the right buttons that you need to see and click on them, and navigating you through that whole experience. That's its own field, and it's kind of new and exciting and really emerging. So those are some of our big umbrellas, and obviously you guys, like I said, are in most of these fields in one sense or other. Probably not package design, but a little bit. Maybe if you want to think about your maybe sponsor logos that you put on your robot or something, we could call that a kind of package. But we're definitely, all of us, probably in logo design and print design and web design, and probably UI, UX to a certain extent. So you guys are all doing that, which is super awesome. So let's talk about designing and defining successful outcomes. So like we said, design has better answers and worse answers. And so we need to figure out how we're going to define a successful outcome. So think about if you're designing an ad, okay, for Jack in the Box versus a fancy steakhouse, right? Those are going to have two totally different feels, right? And so an ad that's a really successful ad for Jack in the Box is going to totally flop for the fancy steakhouse, right? You can imagine that. And vice versa, right? Nobody goes to Jack in the Box expecting a fine dining experience, okay? That's not what they're going for. And so you could develop a piece that's very elegant and beautiful, but it could be totally wrong for a Jack in the Box ad. Or you could design a piece that's super fun and quirky, and it's totally wrong for a steakhouse. So that's pretty obvious, right? But we could think about how that might apply to an FRC team situation, right? Maybe you're designing a flyer for FLL teams that are associated with your team versus sponsor letters that are going out to these major, companies that you want money from. You can imagine those are totally different audiences and totally different goals, right? Right. So what are some of the goals that you would have for like a flyer promoting an FLL event? Can you guys think what that might look like? Yeah.
To attract FLL teams and stuff to come to your event. So you're going to be marketing primarily to, I'd say, the parents actually.
Right.
Because you're going to want hey, your kid's going to have a great experience here. They're going to do well. Come to my event.
Totally. Yeah, the experience is a big piece. What about a sponsor letter? How would that maybe be a little bit different? Thoughts? Yeah. Formal, professional, absolutely. And you're maybe going to be appealing more to how this helps promote their business, right? Where the FLL, maybe it's like, this is going to be such a good experience, you're going to love it. The sponsor doesn't really care about the experience. They just love that their name's out there and associated with helping kids learn STEM, because that's what they're interested in. So one way we can look at this is called personas, okay? And this is something you guys can do on your team, and I think it would be really helpful for you if you're not already doing it. And so personas is where you basically invent a person that you are trying to have your design reach, and you specify everything about them, right? So you're like, okay, so, we're going to call this mom, right, Debbie, and Debbie has 2 little kids, and one of them's in 4th grade, and this kid loves tinkering with stuff, right? This is your parent, right, of the FLL team, and you define everything about them. And then maybe you make like 3 of them, right? So you've got this like mom, and then maybe there's this dad who loves doing projects with his kids, and then maybe one of them's like the kid themselves. And so when you design something, instead of running it by yourself, because everybody that you're running it by probably is going to be someone who's involved in high school robotics, they're all on your team. So you kind of have one demographic. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you like it. It matters if this imagined persona is going to like it, right? Because that's who you're getting at. You can take the Jack in the Box, right, or steakhouse kind of illustration again, right? So who's the kind of person that's going to a steakhouse? Would they like it? You might be like, this is really stuffy and I don't like the look of it, but the person this piece is for totally likes that stuffy look. Like maybe it's a sponsor letter. It's not exciting necessarily to you, but it's perfect for, the person who's in charge of marketing for the company that you're trying to get. Does that make sense? So you can go through, and whenever you're working on a project, or, an easier one, maybe you're working on t-shirts for your team. Do high schoolers think this is cool? Because that's the point of those pieces, right, is for people to see your shirt and be like, that looks super cool, I want to be a part of that team. So that's an easy persona because you guys are that persona. But in these other cases, you get to invent this persona and then kind of imagine in your mind running it by that imaginary person. What are they going to think about this? Is this going to resonate with them? It's really, really helpful. That's something that I do with my clients when we're doing logo design, because they'll get really wrapped up in whether they like it or not, right? And we have to, it doesn't matter with you if you like it or not, actually, right? Does your target audience like it? And so defining who your target audience is going to be a really, really important thing to work on. So again, FLL versus sponsors. Just looking at that there. So we're going to talk about a couple of design principles now, right? So now that we know who we're designing for, how are we going to get them to feel the way we want them to feel? To think our t-shirts are cool, or that they want to sponsor our team, or that they want to join our team, or that they want their kids to join our team, whatever. Things like that we're going to be working on. So hierarchy is one of the main ways that we do that, because you're going to be presenting, especially if you think of like a print piece, right? So this is maybe a flyer. There's a lot of information, and you need to guide the viewer through the most important pieces of information. They're not going to remember everything, right? You guys know that. You get a flyer or a brochure, you just kind of glance over it. You get kind of a general feel of what you think about what it's saying, and then you maybe kind of tune out. You probably don't read every single word. So you need to guide people through and help them see what you think is the most important piece of information. You guys see that, we'll see this in website design all the time if you take a look. Like, what's super trendy in web right now? Okay, there's like your menu up at the top, whatever, with the logo. A big banner, right? You guys have seen this. Big kind of artsy photo with a huge tagline across it, right? You scroll down, there's like 3 sort of supporting bullet points for that tagline, and then like contact us or purchase or whatever, right? It's like, here's the thing, here's a couple other things about the thing, now do something about it. Right? They're guiding you through exactly what they want you to do, and it's super, super intentional. So everything in your design is going to be competing for viewers' attention, and it's your job to decide. First of all, you have to decide first what is the most important information, and then how am I going to show that to them. So I'm going to take a look at a couple examples and ways to do that. So larger items demand more attention. That's easy, right? It sounds simple, but you have to be conscious of what you're doing with that piece of information for it to actually be effective. So obviously here we've got the title of this magazine really big across the top. This kind of egg toast shaped like Maine thing kind of takes secondary position, and then the supporting information around it. But our eye goes right there because it's the biggest. This is one of my favorite examples. Bright colors obviously demand more attention than subdued ones, right? Where does your eye go right away? Title, and then the border, the snow border. And then everything else is very secondary. And it's super intentional, of course, that his jacket exactly matches the color they're using for the title. They want you to link those things together in your mind. And know that faces and images demand more attention as well. There's studies, people look longer at images over text or even graphics like logos and things like that. And then they look way longer at images of faces than just normal images. So here's another example. This is a super cool one, right? Obviously, we've got a face, center stage. Your eye goes right there. Of course, you go to his eyes first because that's how you look at someone. You look into their eyes, and it's boxed, and it brings you right down to the title. Super, super intentional. Very simple and really, really effective, actually. And then here, this is another one of my favorites. More explicitly guiding you through, honestly, right? We've got the arrow pointing you across with the main title, and then that naturally guides your eye to follow it down to the supporting information at the bottom. So does that make sense? And obviously this is something you really have to think about. If you don't know, if you haven't decided what you think is the most important, you're not going to be able to guide your viewers through it at all. So this is something to really think about when you start working on a piece and deciding how you're going to handle it. Now, another way that we can guide people through is through balance, and the balance of different elements in a piece to each other. So formal balance is just a fancy way of talking about symmetry. Okay, so obviously this isn't exactly a mirror image. The text isn't mirrored clearly. The colors are different, but it's very symmetrical down the middle. And this has a very calm, stable feeling to it. Think a wedding invitation, right? Everything's centered right down the middle of that card, okay? That's kind of the feeling that a formal balance or symmetry gives us. Dynamic balance is asymmetry, but it's important to remember this is still a kind of balance, right? You can see we've got this really kind of quirky, fun text dominating in the upper corner there, but then it's balanced out by the ship kind of in the opposite corner, and they're kind of in tension with each other, but they balance each other, right? If you can see how if the ship was over here, it would be asymmetrical, but it wouldn't feel balanced. Or even some of the more nuanced decisions, like you can see that he's got kind of this pink color at the bottom, and that's balanced by kind of using that in the text above. So there's a lot of intentional decisions that this designer is making that help this to feel balanced, even though it's not symmetrical. So that's something you can take into consideration as well. And then negative space. Okay, so negative space basically is white space. But we talk about it as negative space because it actually does a lot of work for us. It's a very powerful design tool. And it's something that I think as young designers, it's very hard for us to get a feel for, because it feels like there's so much empty space. What are we going to do with all that empty space? We got to put stuff in it. Well, I don't know, not necessarily. You got to think about that. And what feels, again, this is going to contribute to hierarchy and balance too. Does something need to be in that space, or is that space actually doing work for us? So I love this poster. There's not a lot happening in this poster, is there? But it's very balanced, and this space is doing a lot of work, right? It says UCLA summer sessions. It's an advertisement for their summer classes, right? So we've got a really abstract kind of beach situation, right? And we have a ruler at the bottom. You can't see, but it says 97 and 98 over the big ticks, and this poster is for the UCLA summer sessions in 1998, right? So it's kind of showing, hey, we're in that space, we're marking off years, and we're kind of in the middle right here, and it's summer. It's actually doing a ton of work, really cool. If you could put class information in that space, it would ruin the whole piece, okay? So just be aware of negative space in your designing. It's something that takes a while to get a feel for, but it's really, really powerful. And I deal with this with clients all the time. I'll give them a piece, and they're like, what about all this space? What are we going to put there? And it's like, no. It's a thing in itself. It's just like when you put an image somewhere, when you put text somewhere, the space is doing work for you and design it, and it can help you to achieve balance and hierarchy and all those things we talked about as well. So does that make sense? All right, so we're going to talk about color spaces. So this is going to be, that was more of the design principles. Now this is going to be a little bit more applied. So we're going to talk about color spaces because it's really, really important. And this is actually hilarious because the color space of our projector is messed up. And so you're not seeing this appropriately. It's supposed to be red, blue, and then that yellow one is supposed to actually be green. So the first color space we're going to talk about is called RGB. And that stands for red, green, and blue. And it's used for screens. So anything where the color is produced by light is going to be using RGB. That's your TV, it's your computer, it's your phone, anything like that. And we give colors a number value within that space from 0 to 255. Okay, so 255 is maximum light, and 0 is no light at all. So if you looked really close at screens, sometimes you see those kind of little colored dots sort of close together, and so it's saying, hey, give the red, 255 on red is give the red all the light you can, and then 255 on green is give green all the light you can. Or if it's 0, it's like, hey, no, don't put any red in there, don't put any blue. And the way those combine, we can see our whole array of colors. So an example would be 91, 227, 0. So that's 91 red, 227 green, and then 0 for the blue. That's actually that's this color right here, okay? Which is interesting because you wouldn't think that there's red in that color, but there is, at least on the screen version. So we got to define values for screens that way. Again, hilarious. You can see it's super messed up. There's supposed to be another circle there, but it's CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K is black or key, because B was already taken in RGB for blue, and well, I'll explain a little bit more as well why that is too. But this is used for print, okay? So it has the opposite effect. So basically when RGB, and you can sort of see it here, you can't fully see it because the colors are weird, but when all of those add together, if you have 255 red, 255 green, 255 blue, you get, does anybody know?
White.
You get white, right. Just how you guys have probably seen light go through a prism and turn into a rainbow, right? So all these colors together make white light, okay? So, and then none of all of them obviously is black, okay? Print, we have the opposite situation. All of these add up to black when they combine, and then none of them, well, that's just paper, right? It's white as well, okay? So they have the opposite. We say these are subtractive, they take light away, and we say that the RGB is additive, okay? So, and the reason that we have a third value, the reason that we have that key color or black as the fourth one is because technically CMY, cyan, magenta, and yellow add up to black, but in practice, when you put all of that ink on a piece of paper, you guys have ever printed piece of like a colored piece on like your home printer, and it comes out like wet and like kind of wobbly, and so there's just so much ink on the paper, right? So it just really piles up and it kind of turns into a sick sort of brown, right? So we have that extra black so that we can get rich blacks in print. Values are listed as 0 to 100%. So 0 for all the values is going to be white. 100% for all the values is going to be black. And so an example is going to be 60, 0, 111. Again, that's also this color. Okay, so we get that green with a lot of cyan, no magenta, a lot of yellow actually, and then a little bit of black. Okay, does that make sense, the difference between those? Now, the reason that it really matters is because not all colors are created equal, okay? So this graph, this is everything, all the colors you guys and me, that people can see with our eyes, right? We know there's like UV and ultraviolet and all those kind of things out there that we can't see, but this is everything we can see, okay? And this yellow line is the RGB gamut, okay? And this blue line is the CMYK gamut, and you can see they're not the same, right? And so you're going to have to figure out what your color values, if you don't already know, are for your team, and you're going to have to translate them to the correct values because your computer is not always going to do a good job of it. If you give it an RGB value up here, CMYK actually can't really handle that very well, which is super interesting. Bright greens in print, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, are a pain in the butt. You can't get vibrant greens. The more cyan and yellow you add, the darker and muddier it gets. You can't get something that looks like this in print, really. And so it's just something that's important to know about when you are choosing color values and making sure that if you're working with a professional printer, you're giving them the correct values. Does that make sense? So you need to know what's color space that you're working in for a given document. The next sort of technical piece we're going to talk about is raster versus vector. Do you guys know about raster versus vector? So raster is what we would call a resolution-dependent photo. You guys have all seen stuff like this where you try to print something, like maybe from Facebook. Facebook's the worst about compressing images, if you guys didn't already know that. And it looks like this, right? You can just see all those little pixels, dots of color, and they're square. And when it's zoomed out, like the image on the left, we don't see all the pixels. They're there, but our eye kind of plays tricks on us and blends them together, and we see it as a smooth gradient. But when we zoom in, this is what's going on, okay? And so a raster image is made up of tiny dots called pixels, and DPI, or dots per inch, is the number of pixels per inch, okay? So if you have 300 pixels per inch, that's kind of what we would want for something we're going to print. That's going to have a ton of pixels per inch. On screen, our eyes are actually better at doing that illusion of seeing stuff as more of a seamless gradient, and so we only need about 72 pixels per inch to look good. So this is going to be good for photos where you, like someone's skin tone, right? It's going to naturally have kind of a gradient to it. There's going to be shadows and shading, and you need all these little dots and pixels to make that happen, okay? Typically, our industry standard is going to be Photoshop for raster images. We'll talk a little bit about industry standards in a minute, but Photoshop or Lightroom is going to be your main go-to. Here's the most important thing, though. Raster images can be scaled down. You can always make them smaller and have less pixels. That's fine. But you can't scale them up, okay? Because you can't invent pixels that weren't there, okay? Your computer will try, but it's just going to duplicate the pixels nearby, and it's still going to look pixelated, okay? So if you guys are in photo or video, you need to be shooting in the resolution that you need. You can't invent it after the fact. So that's something that you're going to want to work through if that's not something you're conscious of already. Now, raster file types, I'm just going to hit this really quick, but just so that you're aware if these aren't familiar to you. PSD is a Photoshop native format. So that's only Photoshop can open that. And it supports layers. So it means it's not just one image. You can stack stuff on top of each other. You could put text on top. And then it can save those and keep them all separate without flattening it down. Does that make sense? Okay. Only Photoshop and other Adobe programs. Adobe is the parent company of Photoshop, if you guys didn't know that. Okay. JPEG, also spelled JPEG, is great for small files. It does a really good job of compressing stuff into a small file size. So if you're putting something on the web, you need that to upload really quickly, especially on like mobile devices and things like that. So JPEG is going to be your friend. but know that it does a thing called lossy compression, which means it forgets some of your pixels when it compresses it. Okay, so once you go to JPEG, it's maybe not a good fit for print anymore, and that's just something you need to be aware of. But it's awesome for web and great for images. Ping, okay, supports transparency. So a JPEG, you can't have a transparent background, but a ping you can. So maybe you need your logo to be kind of on a dark background or something like that on your website. Ping is going to be your buddy there. TIFF also supports layers at a smaller size, and these are, first of all, these are the big three. If you forget all the other ones, these are your big three. TIFF is another one, though. It supports layers at a smaller file size than PSD, and it offers a kind of lossless compression, so it doesn't forget your information when it compresses it. That's really good. And GIF, as you all know, in popular culture lately, supports animation, which is pretty cool, and it also does a lot of compressing for us. Okay, so those are some of our main raster file types. If you see one of these as a file extension, .psd, .jpeg, you're going to know you're working with a raster image. It's got pixels, which means you can scale it down, but you can't scale it up, right? So vector is what we call resolution independent, okay? Raster was resolution dependent. Vector is going to be resolution independent, okay? It's made up of anchor points and vectors. Has anyone covered vectors in like math? A few of us. It's okay. You don't have to super know about it. I don't really remember it from math, even though I covered it. But if you have that image in your mind, it might help you a little bit. So this is going to be good for graphics. So here's what vector file says, okay? Instead of saying, hey, from here to here, it's going to be red, okay? And so make all these little pixel dots and just make them red from here to here, right? Instead, it's going to say, and then the computer's going to say, okay, great, so we need 10 pixels to do that space, and it just knows those 10 pixels, and that's all it knows, okay? With vector, what it's going to do instead is it's going to say, okay, here's a point, like this, okay, and it's going to say, hey, start going this way, and then curve up this way until you get to this point, okay? And do it at a curve that is shaped like this, and it kind of tells it what the shape of the curve is. And then keep curving around the other way until you get to this point, and it tells it what the shape of the curve is, okay? The cool thing about that is that file doesn't care about pixels at all, okay? You could blow up, you could have a vector file that's your logo, and you could have it be this small, and you can literally blow it up and put it on the side of a bus, and you'll never see a single pixel because that file is always reevaluating on the fly how many pixels it needs to go from here to here and here to here and make the curve shaped like that. Does that make sense? So it's not saving the actual pixel information, it's saving the shape information, and then it just makes the pixels depending on what it needs, or prints, or whatever. Does that make sense as a different distinction between raster and vector? So this is what you're going to use a lot for graphics, so logos and things like that, and it's infinitely scalable, which is super cool. So that's just something to know about. Illustrator is going to be, Adobe Illustrator is our industry standard for vector images, okay? And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's an example of kind of what a vector would look like. This is a logo, and you can see it's more graphically based. They've got kind of some gradients applied to it, but it's nothing like the detail that we saw in that flower of all these different colors together. It's very kind of flat. And this, again, is another vector file. You'll see there's kind of more color variation going on, but this is a file that, again, you could print this on the side of a bus. You can just infinitely scale it. And the computer's going to know what to do with that information. Quick thing on vector file types. AI is the Illustrator native format, so kind of the cousin to PSD. Supports layers or objects, so same kind of thing. You can have different pieces in there moving around, and it can remember them all as separate things. And the newer AI, it used to be you could only open it in Illustrator, just like PSD, but the newer ones you can also open in PDF viewers too, which is super cool. So PDF is also a vector file type, but it's not necessarily a vector file type. So what I mean by that is you probably have seen PDFs before, maybe that are scans or something like that, and they have like images in them, right? Is that something you guys have seen before? You know, someone's put an image in that PDF. So that's still a raster image, but PDF can support and can remember vectors. So I hope that distinction makes sense. So just because something is a PDF, it's not necessarily vector, but you can save your logo off as a PDF and it will stay vector. And this is great for sending stuff to printers or to people who don't have Illustrator, who don't have design software, because everybody can open a PDF, okay? EPS is like the old PDF, basically. So before we had PDFs, If you needed to send something to somebody outside of Illustrator, you would use EPS. It's less commonly used now, but just so you know about it. If people are using other design software that's not Illustrator, that's a way to send stuff back and forth between them. And then SVG is called Scalable Vector Graphic, and whenever we need to put vector graphics on the web, we typically use SVG. Okay, so way less common. 9 times out of 10, if you're working with vectors, you're going to be in one of these 2 camps. Okay, so just know what those file types are when you see them. I'm going to skip over this. We'll talk about it in a little bit because we've hit industry standards a little bit. Let's take a look at typography. So what makes good typography? It invites the audience to read, reinforces the content's meaning, demands attention, but then fades into the background. Okay, so people read it and then they're not like distracted by it anymore. Okay, and it's going to affect the reader's mood and comprehension. Okay, so we can see this poster for the Academy Awards. Obviously, it's very regal. Okay, it fits with the mood of the Academy Awards. It's very fancy. Okay, if someone used big block type, that would be super out of place here. That would demand attention, and then it would hold it, right? Because you'd be so distracted. Why is the Academy Awards using this wacky type? Okay, let's see. Let's do a really quick typography terminology, and then I want to move on to some use cases. So who knows what serif versus sans serif is? Yeah.
So serif is basically like it has like all of the little like parts on the text, and then sans serif, it's like plain text. There's no little like...
Totally. So serifs are all these little feet that you can see that the type has. So this is like your Times New Roman. This is your Georgia, your Garamond. Those are some serif typefaces. Sans just means without in French. So any type that doesn't have those little feet, we're going to call sans serif. Obviously, those have some really different feels to them, right? We probably have kind of a pretty visceral reaction to each of those. The bottom one feels very formal, and the top one feels very informal. So again, depending on the personas that you've developed, the purpose of your piece, you're going to pick different typefaces, and they're going to have a really different effect on your viewer. Display versus text type. So display is going to be typefaces that are more decorative, and they're used for big titles and things like that. Text is going to be anything that could be like a whole paragraph. Obviously, if you have to read a whole paragraph of any of the ones on the left, that's going to get really tiresome really quickly. So just be aware of that. I doubt that any of you would go so crazy as to use some of these typefaces for text type, but just be aware of that. Make sure that whatever you're using for big pieces of text is easy on the eyes and you can just flow through it super quickly. And then combining typefaces. Try to limit yourself to 1 or 2 per piece, no more than that. It gets very, very busy otherwise. The best thing to do, and this is something really important, if you remember one thing about type, remember this. Get one good typeface for your team. Something that has a whole bunch of different weights. You may know, if you're working in Word, there's like bold, underline, and italic, right? But if you're working with a good typeface, you'll have 8, sometimes 10 different weights. You'll have thin, light, book, regular, medium, demi-bold, bold, heavy. There's all these different weights, plus the italic versions of all those. And those are all going to mesh really well with each other because they were all designed by the same person. They'll have the same feel to them. And so you can get a lot of work done all in one typeface. So if that's not something you've already considered for your team, it might be something you want to think about. Get a really good, high-quality typeface and just use it everywhere. And you'll find everything feels calm, everything feels unified, and everything's really easy on the eyes because there's not these different competing typefaces. And maybe your title is like a fancy one sometimes, and that's totally fine, but limiting it to 2 is going to really do a lot of work to clean up your type. So here's an example. Helvetica Neue is a really great example of that. Obviously, we've got all these different weights, plus italic versions, plus there's probably more. Okay, so that's kind of the work you can do with a good high-quality typeface. So the rest of our time here, I just want to go through a couple quick applications for FRC teams where we apply what we talked about here in something that you guys are probably already doing, and we can talk about some best practices, okay? So standardizing your brand, okay? Here's the most important thing about branding. It's not just a logo, okay? Everything you do in design work should support your logo and the brand identity, okay? So think about what you would expect Apple product packaging to look like, right? If Apple comes out with a new product, you already know what that packaging looks like, okay? It's white, it has really clean sans serif type on it in a few tasteful places. It probably has one big image of the product on it, right? You already know what they're going to do before they do it. That's good branding. Think about a friend that you know really well, okay? And they're in a situation and someone says something funny and you know your friend's going to say to that already because you know them, okay? So a brand is like a personality, okay? People should know what your brand is going to do before you do it. And that's very calming in a way to people. People know what to expect from your team, from your brand, because you do it in a unified way all the time. And so all of your design pieces should support your logo and support your brand that way. So ways to do that, you're going to want to standardize your key themes and key messages, right? We want our brand to look fun, or we want our brand to look professional, or we want our brand to look, these are decisions you get to make. None of them are right or wrong. Just once you make them, then the things you do that follow that up need to support those decisions. Does that make sense? So colors and fonts are things that you're going to want to standardize. Hey, this is our CMYK colors. These are RGB colors. We always use the same ones. We don't just pick like, oh yeah, that looks like about the right orange. No, you use the same one every time and it feels very unified. Logo configurations, you want to decide, hey, we're going to have a horizontal version and a vertical version, right? And maybe we have one that's just the icon and one that's just the text. And those are the 4 ways we use it, and we don't use it any other ways. Okay, you can't just kind of invent a different logo variation. You always present it in the same way. And then logo size and white space. So whenever I finish a logo design for someone, I give them all the logo files, and then I give them a branding standards packet, and it includes all this information. Okay, they're key themes and messages, which we've discussed. I would have discussed with that client already in the process. Here's your color and fonts, and you're only going to use these ones. Here's all the ways you can use the logo, and then size and white space. So this is a logo that I did, and I told the client the space around the logo should always be the square of the height of the spoon, okay? So it's not crowded, and it's always relative to the size of the logo. So these are decisions, if you haven't made them on behalf of your team and your branding, this is something you can look into, and it'll really improve all of your pieces by making them all feel unified and feel like people know what to expect from you as a brand. So t-shirts, we talked about t-shirts. I know that's kind of a big thing in FRC, right? Everyone's got t-shirts, everyone's trading t-shirts, everyone's trying to make cool ones. So let's talk about file types. What do you guys think? Is this a t-shirt going to be raster or vector, if you don't already know? Totally vector, yeah. Software, Illustrator would be ideal if you have it. If you don't have Illustrator, there's some free alternatives, but Illustrator, like I said, is the industry standard. What about color space? What color space are we going to want to use? CMYK, totally, because it's print. Exactly. And with shirts, if you don't already know this, you want to minimize the number of colors because they often have to do another pass for each color. Okay, so there are ways to minimize colors, and maybe that's something, if you haven't taken that into consideration with your logo design, you could take that into consideration. And then this is something really important. Oh, first of all, getting what you need from your sponsors. Man, you guys, sometimes I used to work for a company and we did benefit runs, okay? And so I was doing t-shirts all the time, and we would have all these sponsors, and run t-shirts that got all the sponsors on the back, just like you guys do. And people were like, oh, can I send you the logo in Word? No, of course not. So it's okay to go back to sponsors and be like, hey, I really need a vector file if you have it, okay? And those are, by the way, AI, EPS, or PDF, and you can tell them that because they may not know. So now you can take this information and make sure you get what you need from your sponsors. And then also, talk to your vendor and ask them questions. If you guys possibly can work with a local printer for any services, I always recommend it over online services because you can talk to them and you can be like, hey, we're really worried about how this green is going to come out because it's not translating well from RGB to CMYK. Can we get a proof and see? Right? And then they may have some recommendations of how to get the color that you're looking for. Or maybe it's a brochure and you're like, I don't really know what kind of paper would be best, but we want something a little heavier, but probably not coated, not glossy. Do you have some recommendations? And they'll give those to you, okay? So always ask questions. They're there to help, and they're the experts. So there's, that can be intimidating going to a printer and not knowing what to ask for. So just know that you always can do that. So again, Illustrator, CMYK. And then lastly, I just want to talk about websites. So designing a successful website. CMS is a content management system, so that's something like WordPress. WordPress is probably the most famous one, but there's Weebly, there's Wix, there's Squarespace. There's a ton that offer different levels of content management. And does anybody use one of those services for their website? Any of those? Okay. So probably you do use one of those. Responsive design is something I mostly want to touch on here, though. Most people, and you guys know this, are viewing websites on mobile devices now. So if your website isn't responsive ready, if it doesn't look as amazing and it isn't as easy to navigate on a phone as a tablet, as a desktop, you're missing a lot of users. And so this is something that you really need to take into consideration if you're not already. And designed for readability and easy access of information. You probably only have about 2 to 3 seconds of someone's time when they first come to your website, or they're going to bounce. And so figuring out, again, with those hierarchy and balance rules, what is the most important thing? If they only are here for 2 seconds, what are they going to see? And is it the things that we want to make sure that they see? Okay? And then obviously keeping content up to date, all that stuff is super important. Okay? So that's everything. I know that was kind of a whirlwind. I just threw a ton of information at you. So what are some questions? What's still lingering for you guys?
Thanks for watching our video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to fruit punch that like button and comment your team number down below. If you want to subscribe, click over here. If you want to watch more Fall Workshop videos, click over here. I'm from Team 1678, and this is Citrus.